Hello and welcome to Newsnight. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. It's our pleasure to have you join us today. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started on February the 24th, has now been on for well over a month, and the situation appears to be one of a stalemate. My guest who witnessed some of the seismic events leading to the dissolution of the then Soviet Union, which produced both Russia and Ukraine, says broken expectations and some level of naivety have led the international community down this path. My guest thinks complications in the relationships between hegemons, international, regional, or even national, have the potential of creating more unintended consequences, such as military conflict, if not handled with care. Newsnight talks to the former president of the American Center for International Leadership, which focuses on, amongst others, U.S.-Soviet or Russia relationships, Mr. Stephen Hayes. Stephen Hayes, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be back again. Thank you.
Let me begin, of course, from some historical antecedent here. You were part of those who witnessed then Russian President Boris Yeltsin's visit to the United States, and in the thaw that followed, the relationship between Russia and the United States grow. But there have been those that have accused the United States in particular and its Western allies of breaching some of the agreements, both gentleman and written, about what was to happen following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then what was to be the relationship between Russia and the former republics, and between Russia and the United States. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I tend to be in agreement with what you just said. I think that there were good intentions. I think that on both sides, and I think that there was probably more trust and elation rather than really digging deep into what it all meant. I think that there were quite a bit of promises made, and again, I think that those promises by the U.S. in the 1990s were basically in good faith. But I think that, again, you're imposing one culture onto a very different culture that was very historically different from the United States. And I think there was a great deal of misunderstanding. And then, of course, there was also mistrust to begin with anyway, because of the Cold War and just the history of both countries. So it was a difficult transition. I think the United States could have done better. I think they created expectations that couldn't be met in a very quick time. That is the transition of the financial system, the transition of how parliament and democracy works. I think that people thought that capitalism and democracy were the same thing, and there was a lot of inequality and growth in the economy at that time, but a great deal of inequality, which disillusioned a lot of people in Russia. Again, I think it was just simply the expectations and the transition were too great to really do it as well as I think it could have been done. There was a great deal of openness to the U.S., particularly among the young at the time, and that was what I was dealing with primarily, being considerably younger than myself. But I think that the criticism is valid. I think that it was not a nefarious undertaking on the U.S. side. I think there was a genuine hope of change, but again, I think there was a lack of understanding of Russian culture, and I think there was clearly a lack of understanding of what democracy really meant in Russia.
The other thing, of course, is, and I want to again leverage on your relationship and you being one of those who witnessed all of this. The various points you have raised, the various points you've mentioned here, for example, the difference between capitalism and democracy and mixing up the two concepts in the early stages in Russia, that, of course, led the way for the eventual emergence of the man who is now president of Russia, first as prime minister and then Of course, subsequently, he succeeded Boris Yeltsin as president. Do you think there's a direct correlation between the incidences you've described, including the broken promises, the naivety, the growing inequality, the disillusionment, and all of that, and the eventual ascension to power of someone like Vladimir Putin?
I think that had something to do with it. I would hesitate to say broken promises quite as much as broken expectations. We don't know what some of the agreements were, and so I'm not ready to jump on my own country as well on that regard. But yes, absolutely. I think you have the disillusionment, the anger, but you also, as I said earlier in another newscast, that I think you also had the mentality of Putin, who would not have accepted any of the changes, even if they worked well, I think, because I think his mentality is very different. His mentality is old Russia, and also the need for empire and a great deal of pride. And I think that that character probably would not have changed, but it did help. What happened in Russia at that time did help bring about the emergence of Vladimir Putin, no doubt about it.
Let's come to the current conflict, shall we, and look at the relationship prior to now between Ukraine and Russia. Everyone seems to be zeroing in on Volodymyr Zelensky, who is the current president. But this has been a long time in coming, this confrontation, as it were, between Russia and Ukraine. Some have traced it back to 2014, when there were incidents in Ukraine which led to the fleeing of the then president, who was seen as pro-Russian. And that was followed almost immediately by the annexation of Crimea. So this is not something that started in 2022 or even in 2021, is it?
No, it isn't. And I would argue that this goes back much further. Remember in the Russian Revolution that the Ukrainians, particularly because the kulaks and the agriculture was based in Ukraine, they were more on the what we called the white Russian side as opposed to red Russia, and were part of the Civil War. And there were 5 million Ukrainians killed in that Civil War. So there's this historic animosity. And that goes back to 1924, so at the time. So and that does make a difference, because as you see, even in the U.S., we're still arguing over the Civil War, which was now more than 170 years ago. So 160, I guess. But in any case, history does play a big role. The issue also, I would say that in 1956, when Khrushchev came in, he also returned Ukraine to its own republic. And that was resented by the Russians. So there's been this historic animosity between Ukraine and Russia. But the bridge, which has been interesting, has been the Russian Orthodox Church, even though there's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church as well, but it's primarily under the Russian Orthodox Church. So that has also played an interesting role in how this all has evolved. But yes, it goes back to in the more recent history, and your point, which is again, I think exactly right. It goes back to the fact that a pro-Russian president was ousted in 2014, and so that's been a long simmering issue. It's certainly been complicated by the threat of, as Putin might see it, the threat of Ukraine wanting to be closer to Western Europe. So yes.
Let's look at the situation where it is right now. So Zelensky wanted, and that's President Zelensky of Ukraine, signaled an intention to become closer to the West, as you put it, possibly even applied to join both the EU and was thinking about joining NATO as well. And that was where Russia said, no, this will not happen, and started the massing of troops. Was it a strategic error on the part of the Ukrainian leader and the Ukrainians to expect that the Western allies would come physically to their aid if they confronted Russia. Was that a strategic error, do you think?
If that is indeed what he thought, yes, it was an error in the reality of global politics. Is that what he assumed? I don't know. He certainly wouldn't come to to his aid if he wasn't in NATO, because there was no defense pact to ensure that. So that was a risk. I think also, in hindsight, again, I think the Austrian example might be good for Ukraine as well, although it's probably too late for that. In that, if he could have assured neutrality, it might have tempered Putin. I think it would have tempered most Russians or most pro-Putin Russians. But the personality of Putin, I'm not sure that it would temper that. I think that he has publicly said that Ukraine's not a real country. Well, with that, that's a very hard mentality to change and to work with. But I think that. I think also Zelensky has realized his error by saying that he's withdrawing or he's backing away from asking to be a NATO member or even talking about it. So, again, your point is yes, that the easy answer is yes. I think it was a strategic error.
Coming to the Russian side, you have worked closely with quite a number of Russians, so there's a character portrait that I want you to paint, and you've also talked about that with President Putin. It comes across from the characterization, not just from you, but from what one has read elsewhere, as someone who is quite hard. And given his background in security services, that should not probably be a surprise. But do you think also he miscalculated at the level of resistance the Ukrainians would put up when he invaded about a month plus ago?
I think he did, because I think he thought it would be over in a week, a quick blitzkrieg to compare his former foes, the German army in 1940. But I think he has really clearly miscalculated, and I think that I hope that it's going to come back to haunt him, and that there'll be a more reasonable leadership in time in Russia. What has emerged, and what I found interesting, is Medvedev and others have of course supported Putin, but also talked about the world wanting to oppress or hammer Russia, and there's a certain paranoia that comes out of that I don't think is valid. I think that. That simply isn't the case, but of course, paranoia creates its own reality and reinforces itself as well.
Given where we are now, there's been more resistance than expected. There hasn't been as much support as was expected from Ukraine, but there's been more resistance to Russia from Ukraine. Some kind of stalemate is beginning to establish itself. Meanwhile, the West continues to slowly but surely strangle Russia's economy. And Russia is trying to fight back, and it's also going almost single-mindedly ahead with destroying what there is of Ukraine that is left after the month. So what exactly do you think is to happen now? What should happen, and what is probably going to be the reality?
Well, on one hand, and I say this with tongue in cheek, I guess, is that we should congratulate Putin for doing what we haven't been able to do, and that is bring Europe and the United States closer together again. It's been good to see that Europe and the United States are now working together much more closely than they have over the last 10 years or so. So he's succeeded in doing that. I think that there's got to be. I agree. Let me say that I agree with you that Putin will continue to push on Ukraine. I think that the Ukrainians will be reinforced more And certainly you can understand why there's greater resistance in Ukraine. It's their own country that's being invaded. And so people are going to fight much harder. And you've got to ask, what's the morale of the Russian soldier coming in and basically attacking Slavic people as well, and who have been seen as their brothers and sisters. So all that is happening, and it is creating at least it appears to be creating a stalemate. So to me, there has to be a face-saving measure for Putin. As much as I don't like that personally, I think that it needs to happen. There needs to be a way for him to step back. I'm not sure that in his own country and with his countrymen around him now, he can afford to step back, though, and that's the problem that I see. If he is seen as stepping back and losing, then his personal position, probably his personal health, is in considerable danger as well. So there must be some measure of face saving. I think Zelensky asking, I guess yesterday, for the fighting to stop was a very positive step. Whether you can get Putin to withdraw, I would anticipate him trying to hold on to the gains that he's made so far, if there is to be any withdrawal. And that's not going to be satisfactory to the Ukrainians because they've lost some territory in that regard. And also, so a key city has been just destroyed in Mariupol. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to find a way out of this. And it's hard to imagine a strong face-saving measure for Putin. So I think he'll continue to push on as far as he can. Then he'll hold on to the gains as much as he can. But it is, I think, heartening, at least to me. Probably is because of my own nationality, but it's heartening to see Europe and the United States coming back together again.
Let's look at the politics. You've touched on the politics of this. I mean, in the case of Russia, where if Mr. Putin is seen not to win, then his personal position and power within Russia may be in danger. If Volodymyr Zelensky is seen to give up Ukraine in any kind of deal, then his position is going to be in danger as well. Is my reading of your position correct?
It's hard to add anything to that. I think you're exactly right. It's a very, very difficult situation to find a satisfactory result from this. The most satisfactory one, of course, is the fighting stops. I could see that where both sides might agree to a ceasefire. I think that's more the Russian decision, of course, than it is a Ukrainian decision. It's a very difficult decision. It's a very difficult situation for international diplomacy right now.
It's also very difficult. You've alluded to that a couple of times. I mean, you're an American, and it's also a very difficult position for President Joe Biden as well. I mean, he just got out of Afghanistan and said, look, we got to cut when we got to cut. And now then this situation. And ordinary Americans are already feeling the pinch at the pumps in terms of gas prices. And then you've got the midterm elections later on in the year, which will probably be the first real test of his presidency. So again, politically, he's also walking a tightrope, isn't he?
Absolutely. I think he's done a better job, in my opinion, than a lot of us expected. It's hard to say pleased about anything in regards to war, but I think that he's done a far better job than the public had been giving him credit for, and it's showing in poll numbers as well. But yes, he's walking a very tightrope here in the United States, and I think also one of the issues that's going to be determining midterm is how many people really get to the polls, and the voting restrictions that that states are putting in is going to make it very difficult and perhaps misleading on the amount of public support that Biden will get. We'll see, but his poll numbers are going up. How long the United States public will tolerate rising gas prices, I don't know. It's tough. I mean, going to the gas pump at least once or twice a week myself, and then watching the prices go up. And then lately they've dropped a little. So again, there's been the diplomacy of internal diplomacy, I say, on the oil companies to cut down as well. So it's a mess. Quite honestly, it's a lot of uncertainty in this United States. Yeah, the world knows it's a divided country as well in many ways, and it's a problem.
Again, I asked this again, possibly with some trepidation, especially because it's something that requires strategic thinking, and that is that the U.S. is already in a face-off, a trade face-off with China. And there are difficulties in the relationship over what has happened in Hong Kong and what has happened in Taiwan. And then now there's a potential for a conflict with another hegemon in Russia. And therefore, when I talked about a tightrope and President Biden and keeping America safe, there's so much to unpack here. And you talked about it just now when you mentioned the issue of a divided country. How do you see him navigating all of this, especially given your work as a former leader of the American Center for International Leadership? Because all of this is about leadership, isn't it?
It is, and that comes to a couple of other points. I also I took one of the first young leaders programs into China as well in 1986, beginning in 1987, when China was opening up. So I've spent a lot of time in China. I've made 10, 15 trips at least, and the last trip was, I think, 2016, when I also tried to get American businessmen to understand China's involvement in Africa better by actually talking to the Chinese. So I think that the China relationship hasn't been handled well. I think we've made the Chinese the China, I guess, the boogeyman of international trade, blaming them for disparity in trade and so forth. Not that they don't deserve a lot of that, but on the other hand, our companies rushed into China knowing what they were going into, although they deny that now. But I think that the China relationship should be managed, could be managed much better. I think that, again, the militarization in China does concern me, but also the lack of real dialogue. I think a deeper dialogue between the U.S. and China is hurting the rest of the world as well as it is both countries, frankly. I think there's bridges that need to be rebuilt. And I think that one of the things that could happen is, again, when you talk about leadership, that we need to find ways to get younger leaders more in direct dialogue with one another, be it Russia, or China or Africa, and that's just not happening. It's social media is important, I guess, but it's not face to face, and we need to build trust. We've lost both China and the U.S. has lost trust between themselves, among themselves, and it's something that the world can't afford to see happen much longer.
Given what you've just explained about the tensions, the geopolitical tensions between China and the U.S. and how it's been handled, and then now the unfolding situation with Russia, do we then take it that going forward, this situation in Ukraine will have to be handled differently? And if so, how?
I don't know how you handle it differently. Clearly, you have to handle it differently if you want the war to stop. So there needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be also probably a third party that's trusted by both sides. I think that's going to be extremely hard to find. But there needs to be a dialogue. That dialogue is not happening. And I think that's the biggest challenge right now. I do worry about pushing Russia into a corner where they feel they have to really strike out. I think that Mr. Putin would feel that way, particularly given his personality and history. But on the other hand, you can't show weakness in such situations. And so that makes it even more of a tightrope to walk. I don't think there's an easy answer here. And anybody that says that there is an easy answer, I think is wrong.
All right, Stephen, let me take you away from the conflict itself to some of the unintended, perhaps, consequences, shall we say. And one of them is, first, in Europe itself, the reliance on Russian gas. We have heard so much in the last couple of days about Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipeline that takes the bulk of the gas that Europe uses from Russia through to Europe. And there have been all these schemes about weaning Europe off Russian gas in the aftermath of this conflict. Do you think this is, first, practical, and secondly, is it doable in good enough time?
Well, I'll take it in reverse order. It's certainly doable. Practical, of course, is the most direct line is the pipeline, but it's not practical if, in fact, Russia is going to use that as a weapon, which clearly now it's been proven that they are going to use that as a weapon. So I think it's actually going to help places like Africa, especially Nigeria. It's going to help the U.S. Producers as well. It's going to take longer to get to Europe, but I would question how much longer, because it takes 3 days to get a ship across the Atlantic now. So that's going to be 3 days of time versus whatever time it takes for the natural gas to move through the pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to especially Germany. So it's just something that I think Europe needs to do now. I think they've learned that they're far more vulnerable than they thought they were. So I think it's in their interest also to diversify their gas supply. Would I cut off the gas? Not necessarily, maybe right now, yes, but again, use it in the future, but not, the lesson is don't become dependent on one source, because it's very dangerous to become dependent on only one source.
One of the things that this conflict has showed is the strategic importance of both Russia and Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for essentially the world. Between the both of them, they produce so many commodities and metals and all of that, that many people did not know that were coming from either Russia or the Ukraine, especially people not like you, who are, of course, in this on a day-to-day basis. And the ripple effect is going around the world. Take, for example, the issue of wheat. A lot of countries, Egypt, Nigeria, a couple of other countries in Africa and elsewhere, import a lot of wheat from both Russia and Ukraine. And between the both of them, some estimates are that they produce about half of the world's supply of wheat, for example.
Well, I think the official number is whatever official means these days, but is 20%, 26% of the global wheat. And then you add corn in that, and yes, it's between 40 and 50% of the world's grain comes from Ukraine and Russia, and that's astounding. The other three major producers would be the United States, Argentina, and Australia. So this has enormous implications for a lot of countries. I think Africa gets roughly 40% of its grain from Ukraine and Russia. So that's going to create, you hate to use the word again, but enormous stress on global food supplies. Certainly it's going to create a lot of problems in Africa. Nigeria would be one of those countries. It's very dependent on, I think, particularly Russian grain. North Africa is dependent on both Russia and Ukrainian grain. And interestingly, I've learned a lot in this last few weeks too by looking at and been surprised by the supplies that do come from Russia and Ukraine on food. But this could benefit Ethiopia because they are a very large grain producer with more potential. But of course, their civil war now is hampering that grain supply as well. So yeah, this is affecting the rest of the world. I think far more significantly. It probably will show on the longer term. There are grain reserves now in most countries, but not a lot. So I think in the next month or two, is you'll be seeing quite a bit of the strain. The other surprise is that they produce about 54% of the Ukraine and Russia supply about 54% of the sunflower oil, which is a major cooking ingredient worldwide, and particularly is needed in Africa. So this is creating all types of problems that I think is going to be felt in many, many ways.
Now, you run the oldest consulting firm with a specialization in U.S.-Africa trade and political relations as well. So, I mean, you're in a good position to look at this very next issue, and I'm happy you turned our attention to Africa in your answer to the last question. Ordinarily, Africa, in many of these respects, has some, if not all, these products that Russia and Ukraine dominate world supply in, and ordinarily should be taking advantage of this. Now, what are your contacts telling you about how they're going about this, if they're going about this, and if they're not, why they're not?
The reality is that Africa could supply the entire world with grain. It has a very, I've forgotten the percentage, but it's a very high percentage, and maybe as high as 90% of the world's arable land that is still available for cultivation. It's not being cultivated. So Africa could be the grain basket for the world, not only for itself. Whether, in fact, it's going to be able to make that transition is going to depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on governance and when I say that, the policies towards agriculture and agribusiness in various countries. It's going to depend on a greater openness of trade and development in the agriculture sector. And then this I find interesting in that we go back to the old Soviet Union, in which they pushed industrialization over agriculture and had great deal of starvation in the 1920s. So particularly in Ukraine again. But I think that the debate ahead for Africa is are they going to develop agriculture as much as they are on industrialization? And I think it's really important. I've always been an advocate of stronger agriculture, because I think also one of the problems in Africa is the migration to the urban areas and trying to find jobs there. We need in Africa, I think, a greater dispersal of the population, be able to keep and stay in villages and homes, in larger cities as well, not quite the mega cities of Lagos and Abuja. So agriculture is a way to I think, move in that direction. Industrialization, I think, will continue to congregate populations and make it even more difficult on food supplies.
Is there a case here of the chicken and the egg? And I'll explain. I mean, Africa already produces a great deal of raw materials. They produce a lot of raw materials, both in terms of cash crops, commodities, and metals. A lot of that gets shipped out in its raw form and gets processed, and Africa gets to buy those back after value additions have been put on them. Now, do you see that also as part of the lesson from this Russia-Ukraine conflict, that there needs to be more value addition in continent or in country, depending on where we're talking about? And how do they go about this? Again, I want to leverage on your long-term relationship with some of these countries and what have been their barriers to being able to do this.
Well, benefication or the value added I think, is really important for Africa. I think Africa, in a sense, is not even in a sense, historically has been ripped off. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The raw products have been taken out. For instance, let's say in the Sahel area, where cotton has been grown and then taken to Europe and then sold back at a higher price to Africa, the clothing sold back to Africa. And you can't advance with that type of process. Botswana has done very well with beneficiation on diamonds, for instance. It's polished, produced, refined the diamonds in Botswana, and it's made Botswana one of the more prosperous countries in Africa. So I think the more that does take place, the better. And you're right, Africa produces a lot of the most strategic minerals in the world right now. Cobalt would be one, particularly from the DRC. That's also going to be interesting because those cobalt mines have been Russian mines. So what is some of them? So what is the effect of the global embargo on Russian issues? Also in Angola, the major mine in Angola is Russian. So it's obviously going to affect those. So to me, this just underlines the importance of having beneficiation in each of these countries as much as possible. To do that, again, though, it requires a reliable supply chain from mine to production to market. And this also requires stronger infrastructure. So infrastructure is going to have to be built certainly at a more rapid pace than it is being built now, especially in those countries with the strategic minerals, Angola, Mozambique, DRC, Central Africa area, especially, but it's not exclusively. So it comes back to governance. It comes back to good policy and developing a supply chain. And I think to some extent, developing a stronger private sector. Certainly in a country like Nigeria, a stronger private sector is, I think, vital to the development of the country. And I think that's been proven over the last several years, where you do have a vital, a growing private sector.
How much frustration is there for those of you who interface on the continent with its leaders and its business tycoons and so on, about inconsistency of policy? I raised that because you mentioned the issue of governance and what enables reliable supply chains to develop and for people to bring in investment, we are told, is this stability of policy. That seems to still, so many years down the line, be absent.
I was smiling because you said the word frustration, and that's one word that I identify with so strongly in dealing often in Africa. It just becomes so frustrating at times. You feel like you're taking one step forward and then two steps back. You think that the policies are going to change, not that they should change because somebody in the United States wants them to change, but clearly a consistent policy which people can go by, both not only simply in their public life, but also their business life, their economics, is really important. One of the problems is, I think, that the transition from one administration to another, which again is why I think that in Africa particularly, there needs to be a stronger reliance on democracy. I'm not one who pushes democracy because I don't think it's the answer to all things. But the fact is that when one government transitions to another, often policies that have been set the previous administration are reversed. Contracts are reviewed again, taken away, and so nothing happens. And I think there's got to be a trust level. And that's why I think governance, regardless of the system of governance, good governance needs to happen more regularly throughout Africa. I think one of the problems that Mr. Putin has created, that's unfair to him. He hasn't created it, but the fact is that his style of government has encouraged the policies of strongmen in Africa, and might I say, previously in the United States as well. And that just simply doesn't work well. It becomes where one group of people hoard the wealth and the rest of the countries suffer. So I think there's got to be a more uniform code of guide, or I don't know if it's uniform, but certainly a stronger need and development of government infrastructure, not simply the roads and highways of infrastructure, but an infrastructure of government throughout the continent and frankly throughout the world that people can trust and rely on and know that they can develop long term rather than worry about where their food's coming from the next day.
All this is, of course, happening at a time that, for some, reluctantly, America has turned inwards. One would have expected that, and that had been the case for quite a while under the present world system, that America took the lead and acted more or less like the policeman of the world. But that all this is happening and that all these hegemons that were referred to earlier on, whether they be regional or world, are a bit more confident about stepping onto the world stage because America has stepped off. We remember the America First policy under the previous administration of President Donald Trump, and that was that, look, if America wasn't going to benefit directly from all of this, and this had to do, of course, with trade as well, we didn't want any part of it. Do you think this also is feeding the narrative that it's every man for himself, and so if you're strong, then you can get away with bullying those who aren't so strong?
I think that I don't think there's any question about that. Americans will argue about it, but I think that that narrative was set under the Trump administration, and it really set back the world in different ways. The idea of America first, certainly every country needs to look after itself as well, but we are so interdependent that you can't put one country over another these days, particularly with climate change issues and so forth. You've got to find ways to cooperate. The issue, it's not, the U.S. has certainly been the policeman since World War II, but there's always been in this country a split of isolationism versus globalism. And we've never really found the balance of that. And I think we swung so strongly in favor of globalism over the time, and particularly since probably the Clinton administration, well, certainly before the Clinton administration. But and it's created a stronger resentment among those who favor a more isolationism. And I think that's one of the sources of the split that we have. It's also a historical split that goes back to even before the Civil War, but we are a very divided nation. It's just that that division has been far more apparent over the last 10 years. Primarily, I think, because of the Trump election, but the Trump election would not have been possible had there not been such a split, a division within this country to begin with. So there's a process here that has to go on too as to how we begin to pull the country back together. And again, strangely, we might be thanking Mr. Putin for unifying the country, at least temporarily, in terms of support for Ukraine and the empathy. But what's happened, to return to, I think, what the subject that we need to be talking about too is Africa, is that there hasn't been a really new policy towards Africa. Certainly the Biden administration has made its, I think, 3 cornerstones. One was health, one was on democracy, and I think the other was just general development. But climate change, health, and democracy has been the 3 points that the Biden administration is emphasizing. You have got to address other issues. Democracy by itself doesn't heal anything. It's just a process. It's not a thing. It's a process that's made possible by people being involved in the systems. So I think that we've got to pull together, and I think there's got to be a stronger, clearer policy towards Africa from the Biden administration as well. It's certainly better than the Trump administration, which really had no policy towards Africa except, I would say, malign neglect. But there needs to be a stronger U.S.-Africa policy as well.
Talk a little bit before we round this up about the emergence of these other hegemons that I referred to earlier on. I mean, you've also, as you pointed out, worked closely with China or in China. And of course, we now see Russia also stepping up to the stage. I referenced China and Hong Kong earlier on in the discussion, as well as Taiwan. Do you see that with what has happened now in Ukraine, some of these other countries may feel a bit emboldened, would you say, to pursue their national strategies with regards to these conflicts outside, particularly, of international bodies?
Well, none of us are perfect in our predictions, in fact, often wrong. But I don't see China invading Taiwan, or certainly they've pretty well taken over Hong Kong, and that's a given. I think they'll continue to rely on long-term diplomacy on Taiwan. I think there is certainly a concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that there's certainly a strong military in China, and it's 1/4 of the official Chinese constitution. That the military is one of the four pillars of the constitution. And I think there's a more hawkish view to Taiwan. It's a historical issue to China. It's a point of great pride. But Taiwan has evolved into its own entity, but it's something that China won't accept. So I think that's a long-term issue. I do not see them invading Taiwan, and it's just it's not historically within the Chinese character. It's one they take more, I think, to complement China. I think they take a long-term view, and they also have a process in their own governance, whether we like that process or not, that does bring various elements together to determine policy. China becomes a danger if those balances are separated. Those balances include the intellectual group, which is again under the Chinese Committee for the Consultative Committee on Political Committee. I've messed up the title, but it's 1/4 of the Constitution too. That's where the intellectual groups, the scientists come in. That's part of it. The Parliament is the other, and the Army. So all those are a balance. If China maintains that balance, then I think that it's a long-term issue, not a war situation. But again, maintaining that balance is the issue. And to your point, is Xi going to become more a strong man? He's certainly following the Putin example, except that I think there are probably a little more reins within the Chinese system that will prevent that, but it's not necessarily so. There was the Maoist period, which had very, very little control beyond Mao. So it's why I keep saying we're in, I think, the most dangerous period of world history, frankly.
Stephen Hayes, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your patience and for your perspective. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.